1943, Ottawa, Canada. The Second World War raged across continents, but in Ottawa the battle unfolded through paper, wires, and whispers. Beneath its calm, bureaucratic order, the city hosted a quiet front of espionage. The Soviet embassy, an unremarkable brick building near the Rideau Canal, served as one of Moscow's key outposts. Inside its cipher room, 26-year-old Igor Gouzenko spent his days transforming streams of coded numbers into the intelligence that fed Stalin's war machine. He was a low-ranking clerk of the GRU, the Soviet Military Intelligence Directorate, yet his hands touched information that passed between the Kremlin and its agents across North America. Each morning, fresh cables arrived from Moscow. Each night, he dispatched encrypted replies to sources buried in Canada's research institutes and government offices. The task demanded precision, secrecy, and total loyalty. From his desk flowed reports on aircraft designs, radar experiments, and the mysterious Allied uranium project, fragments of knowledge that Moscow assembled into a picture of Western science. The embassy's discipline was suffocating. Every typewriter was locked after use, every scrap of paper burned. The political attaché functioned as both superior and informant, observing colleagues for signs of fatigue or doubt. Radios were banned, newspapers vetted, conversations recorded. The cipher room itself was sealed each night with red wax stamped by the Soviet crest, a ritual of control as absolute as any prison. Gouzenko performed it mechanically, but each stamp reminded him that the system trusted no one, not even its servants abroad. He and his wife, Svetlana, lived across the street in a cramped flat reserved for embassy staff. Their windows faced Parliament Hill, but the view meant little. They were foreigners inside an invisible cage. Svetlana's pregnancy brought joy and dread in equal measure. News from Moscow spoke of purges within the Foreign Service, of officers recalled for clarification who were never heard from again. Each telegram confirming another disappearance deepened their unease. In 1944, the tone of Moscow's orders changed. Victory over Germany seemed likely, and the Kremlin's focus shifted from alliance to advantage. Increase acquisition, one message commanded. Secure industrial and atomic data from Canadian and British sources. Gouzenko realized he was processing the communications of a spy network expanding beneath the feet of its wartime allies. Canada's National Research Council, the Department of External Affairs, and the British Scientific Mission in Montreal all appeared in his decrypts. The Soviet Union, while fighting fascism, was already planning the next contest against its partners. The contradiction gnawed at him. He had believed that socialism was humanity's defense against tyranny. Instead, he watched it mirror the cruelty it claimed to oppose. His fellow officers boasted of ideological purity while hoarding Western luxuries and policing one another. Fear, not conviction, kept them loyal. Gouzenko began to imagine what awaited him when his name appeared on a recall list. The thought of interrogation in the Lubyanka chilled him more than any Canadian winter. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, Ottawa erupted in celebration. Inside the embassy, champagne was forbidden. Peace, the colonel said, was only another phase of struggle. Soon afterward came the notice of rotation of personnel. Gouzenko knew what that meant, an order to return home, where loyalty would be questioned and confession demanded. The line between duty and survival vanished. By late summer, he began to act. After hours he lingered in the cipher room, quietly copying telegrams and reports. He chose documents naming agents, payment lists, and directives that proved the existence of a Soviet network within Canada. Each sheet, folded into his briefcase, increased his terror and his resolve. If discovered, he would be executed. If successful, he might earn asylum. At night, unable to sleep, he watched Canadians strolling under the streetlights, free citizens of a world his government called corrupt. He envied their casual laughter, their sense of safety. For the first time, the propaganda that had shaped his life seemed hollow. What he feared most was not death, but returning to a nation that punished thought. By September 1945, Gouzenko's double life was complete. To his superiors, he remained the obedient cipher clerk. To himself, he was already a defector in waiting. In the quiet of his locked office, surrounded by typewriters and carbon paper, he planned his escape from an empire built on secrecy. Within days, he would walk out carrying a folder of classified reports that would expose Moscow's hidden war in the West, and in doing so, ignite the first true spark of the Cold War. 1944, Soviet Embassy, Ottawa. Life inside the Soviet mission in Ottawa moved according to Moscow's rhythm, not Canada's. The embassy's staff lived in a world fenced off from the country surrounding them, their meals, movements, and friendships dictated by invisible rules. To outsiders, they appeared as polite diplomats. Within, they inhabited a miniature replica of Stalin's state. The walls carried microphones, the corridors carried whispers, and every door seemed to open onto suspicion. The building itself was both workplace and surveillance post. Its upper floors housed clerks, cipher operators, and political officers who monitored one another as closely as they monitored the West. Each office door bore a lock approved by Moscow. Every typewriter was registered by serial number. Gouzenko worked in the cipher section on the top floor, his desk placed near the safe containing the embassy's code books. There were no windows in that room, only fluorescent light, the hum of machinery, and the constant smell of burnt paper from the incinerator where drafts were destroyed nightly. Between transmissions, the atmosphere was tense. Conversations rarely drifted beyond official matters, and laughter was suspect. A misplaced comment could become a report to the resident security officer, who sent weekly summaries to Moscow Center. Gouzenko's direct superior, Colonel Nikolai Zabotin, was a seasoned intelligence officer whose authority combined military discipline with political zeal. To him, every clerk was a potential leak, every moment of fatigue an ideological weakness. The staff's social life revolved around mandatory gatherings, Soviet holidays, lectures on Marxism, and film screenings of propaganda reels sent from Moscow. Attendance was compulsory, enthusiasm expected. Gouzenko noticed how even these small events served as tests of loyalty. Those who clapped too little drew attention. Those who clapped too much seemed insincere. The embassy functioned like a microcosm of Stalin's paranoia transplanted into Canadian soil. Despite the embassy's secrecy, it was not isolated from the currents of war. Ottawa had become a hub of Allied planning. British and American missions circulated through the capital, sharing offices with Canadian officials. Soviet representatives were treated with cautious courtesy, but Gouzenko sensed the growing distance between the USSR and its allies. The war's end was approaching, and the alliance of necessity was turning to an alliance of mistrust. Inside the mission, new cables arrived from Moscow, demanding faster results and broader recruitment. Zabutin pressed his officers to expand networks among Canadian civil servants and scientists. Some of these agents operated under deep cover, codenamed Gordon, E, and Gray, their real names known only to Moscow. Gouzenko handled their reports daily, his typewriter clattering out decrypted summaries of blueprints, research notes, and confidential government briefings. The material flowed to Moscow in sealed pouches marked as diplomatic correspondence. He began to realize that espionage, not diplomacy, was the embassy's true function. The official diplomats served as couriers and handlers, their briefcases carrying microfilm instead of treaties. The Soviet state regarded the entire world as a field of operations. To fail to collect intelligence was itself a form of sabotage. At home, life differed little from the office. The Gouzenkos lived under constant observation. Their neighbors were fellow staff, each expected to report unusual behavior. Even letters to family in Moscow had to pass through Zabutin's office for censorship. The walls of their apartment were thin, and they spoke in whispers. Svetlana, weary and anxious, spent her days sewing clothes for their unborn child and her nights waiting for her husband to return from the embassy after dark. Fear settled into routine, an unspoken companion at every meal. The birth of their son in early 1945 intensified Gouzenko's unease. He held the infant and wondered what kind of world awaited him. In Moscow, children were raised to denounce their parents for disloyalty. In Canada, children played freely in the streets. The contrast became unbearable. He found himself staring at Canadian families in parks, struck by their unguarded laughter. It was a vision of life without suspicion, something he had never known. Inside the embassy, discipline tightened further. With Germany nearing defeat, the GRU shifted its attention to securing post-war intelligence. Orders from Moscow demanded new sources in atomic research and Western political circles. Every week, the cables grew more insistent, the tone more threatening. Failures were to be reported directly to headquarters. Zabutin grew harsher, berating his subordinates for bourgeois complacency. Gouzenko's nerves frayed under the pressure. 1945, Ottawa, Canada. By the final months of the war, Igor Gouzenko's dual existence had reached the edge of collapse. The embassy corridors hummed with talk of post-war restructuring, of new assignments, and recall lists from Moscow. Each name circulated in a whisper. Each omission felt like a death sentence deferred. For Gouzenko, whose faith in the Soviet system had drained away, the possibility of being summoned home meant something worse than fear. It meant certainty. He knew what awaited recalled officers. The archives back in Moscow recorded it with bureaucratic precision. Re-evaluation on his debriefing, internal reassignment. Those words masked interrogation, forced confession, and erasure. He had seen colleagues vanish after similar notices, men who had shared his office, their desks cleared overnight. The embassy never mentioned them again. In the cipher room, silence was the only permitted grief. At home, his wife felt the pressure as acutely as he did. Svetlana's world was the small apartment, the baby's crib, and the constant hum of dread. The child's cries seemed to echo against the weight of secrecy that ruled their lives. When she asked about returning to Moscow, Gouzenko avoided her eyes. He had already decided they never would. But escape from the Soviet mission was nearly impossible. Their passports were controlled by the embassy, their movements monitored. their building filled with watchers loyal to Colonel Zabatin. The news from Moscow was grim: purges in the Foreign Service, trials of officers accused of ideological weakness, reports of wives imprisoned alongside husbands. In his stolen moments of solitude, Gouzenko reread the cables passing through his hands, dozens of decrypted messages proving the existence of Soviet spies in Canada's research centers and ministries. Each name and code word represented both evidence and salvation. He began to understand that these papers were the only weapon he possessed. By late August, he had gathered over 100 pages, translations of intercepted traffic, lists of agents, and instructions from Moscow Center. The material exposed a network that reached deep into Canadian government offices, even touching projects related to atomic research. The weight of it frightened him. If discovered, he would be accused of treason. If caught trying to flee, he would vanish like the others. Yet doing nothing meant eventual recall, interrogation, and execution. The embassy itself seemed to close in around him. Zabatin's mood had turned volatile, shouting at subordinates over delays and missing reports. The political officer, always listening, had begun asking questions about loyalty and morale. New orders from Moscow demanded a full personnel review. Gouzenko read between the lines, a purge disguised as inspection. He knew he would not survive it. One evening, as the embassy lights dimmed, he lingered in the cipher room long after his shift. He spread the documents before him, coded telegrams, summaries, and the names of agents. The silence pressed down like a weight. He imagined his wife waiting in their apartment, unaware that he had already crossed an invisible boundary. He slid the papers into his briefcase and locked the safe. The decision, once unimaginable, was now final. He would defect. At home that night, he told Svetlana the truth. She stared at him, holding their infant son, the fear in her eyes mirroring his own. There was no argument, only resignation. She asked one question: where would they go? He had no answer. He knew only that he must reach Canadian authorities before the embassy discovered the missing papers. On the morning of September 5th, 1945, Gouzenko left the Soviet embassy for the last time. The sky was pale and still, the streets quiet. In his briefcase lay the evidence that could expose an entire espionage network, and the proof that he had just signed his own death warrant. He walked first to the Ottawa Journal, the city's main newspaper, asking to speak with an editor about a matter of international importance. The clerk, unimpressed by the nervous foreigner, turned him away. Next, he went to the Department of Justice, where officials dismissed his claims as fantasy. To them, he was a frightened immigrant babbling about Soviet spies and atomic secrets. Exhausted, he returned home, terrified and certain he had failed. That night, as they tried to sleep, headlights flared outside their window. Through the curtains, they saw men moving in the shadows. Soviet officers had realized the documents were gone. Footsteps creaked in the hallway, followed by a knock that froze Gouzenko's blood. He pressed his wife and child into a bedroom closet and waited as the door handle turned. Only the arrival of a curious neighbor interrupted the break-in, forcing the intruders to flee into the night. The next 24 hours would decide whether his family lived or vanished. September 5th, 1945, Ottawa, Canada. The September air was still warm when Igor Gouzenko left his apartment carrying the briefcase of stolen papers. The city looked unchanged, quiet, bureaucratic, and unaware that a global shift was about to begin. The documents inside the case revealed Soviet espionage on a scale few in the West could imagine. Reports naming agents within the Canadian Civil Service, scientists in atomic research, and operatives linked to Britain and the United States. For Gouzenko, they were not only evidence of treachery, but the key to his family's survival. He walked through the early evening streets toward the Ottawa Journal, rehearsing the story he would tell. A tired clerk received him at the front desk, unimpressed by the anxious man with a foreign accent. When Gouzenko explained that he carried proof of a vast Soviet spy network, she frowned, thinking him delusional. The editor never came down. Deflated, he left the building, the documents still hidden under his arm. His next stop was the Department of Justice, where he again pleaded to speak with an official. He waited in the lobby for hours, watched by indifferent guards. At last, a minor officer told him to return in the morning, that such matters required proper channels. No one seemed to understand that he would not live until morning if he went home empty-handed. The embassy would already know of the missing files. As darkness fell, Gouzenko trudged back through the quiet neighborhoods near the canal. Ottawa's lamplit calm felt almost mocking. Behind one row of windows, Canadians ate dinner, unaware that their city housed a Soviet spy network, or that one frightened man was trying to expose it. When he reached his apartment, Svetlana was waiting, clutching their infant son. She had sensed the danger. They spoke little. There was nothing left to decide. Sometime after midnight, the first knock came at the door, measured, deliberate, then another, louder. Through the peephole, he saw two men in civilian coats, faces he recognized from the embassy. His pulse surged. He whispered for Svetlana to take the baby and hide. The men tried the handle. When it resisted, one pressed his shoulder against the door. The thin wood shuddered but held. Gouzenko grabbed a kitchen chair and wedged it under the knob. The pounding stopped, replaced by silence. Minutes crawled by. Then glass shattered from the corridor window, the sound of someone trying another way in. A neighbor from across the hall, awakened by the commotion, shouted that he was calling the police. The footsteps retreated, the building falling quiet once more. Gouzenko slumped to the floor, trembling, the briefcase clutched against his chest. The Soviets would not stop now. At dawn, he went to the Ottawa police station, his nerves frayed but his purpose clear. The officer on duty listened skeptically, unsure what to make of the pale man speaking in broken English about dangerous Russians. Still, he phoned the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who sent an agent to meet Gouzenko in a side office. There, the clerk opened his case and spread out the documents, rows of decrypted telegrams, lists of names, and orders signed with Soviet seals. The constable, startled by the authenticity, phoned higher authorities. That morning, as the embassy staff discovered his absence, the Canadian government moved Gouzenko, his wife, and their child into protective custody. Soviet officials arrived at his apartment hours later, demanding entry, claiming a missing employee. The police refused. Behind that locked door, the Cold War quietly began. The Soviet mission, enraged and humiliated, cabled Moscow for instructions. The order that returned was terse: retrieve the material, silence the traitor, and erase the scandal. But it was already too late. The clerk they had underestimated was now under Canadian guard, and the secrets he carried would soon explode across Western intelligence circles. In less than 24 hours, Gouzenko had moved from anonymity to the center of an unfolding geopolitical storm. His act of desperation, born of fear, not ambition, would shatter the illusion of wartime unity and expose the shadow war already underway between East and West. September 6th, 1945, Ottawa, Canada. Dawn crept over Ottawa as word spread through the Soviet embassy that one of their cipher clerks had disappeared, and with him a trove of classified material. Within hours, panic hardened into fury. Colonel Nikolai Zabutin, the GRU resident, ordered his officers to locate Gouzenko immediately. To Moscow, the loss of even a single page of code sheets was intolerable. The disappearance of a cipher clerk carrying proof of Soviet espionage in a friendly nation was a catastrophe. At first, the embassy attempted discretion. Two men were sent to Gouzenko's apartment under the pretext of a welfare visit. When they found the door locked, they broke the hall window, hoping to force entry. The noise drew neighbors, and police arrived before the men could finish their search. The officers claimed diplomatic immunity and retreated, but the message was clear. Moscow wanted its fugitives silenced. Meanwhile, Gouzenko and his family had been moved by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police to a secure location on the outskirts of the city. There, hidden in a small government safe house, he began recounting everything he knew. The RCMP officers, initially cautious, listened as he described the GRU's Canadian network, names, code numbers, and instructions that matched real positions within government offices. As he spread his papers across the table, the investigators realized they were staring at the first tangible proof of Soviet espionage in the West. For Gouzenko, the relief was tempered by terror. He slept little, haunted by the thought that Soviet agents might still reach him. The RCMP changed safe houses several times, moving the family at night through empty streets. At each stop, they drew the blinds and kept the lights low. The baby's cries were muffled under blankets, every sound a risk. He had escaped the embassy, but not yet the danger. The Soviets refused to admit defeat. All day, embassy vehicles prowled the city's streets, visiting police stations, ministries, and even newspaper offices, insisting that Gouzenko be returned. Zabutin personally visited Canada's External Affairs Department, demanding the missing translator be handed back to his lawful superiors. His tone was diplomatic, but his meaning unmistakable. Canadian officials, uncertain how to respond, promised only to look into the matter. Inside government circles, confusion reigned. Canada had no precedent for handling a high-level defector. Prime Minister Mackenzie King was informed that a Soviet officer sought asylum and carried documents alleging espionage against Canada and its allies. At first, he doubted the story. The war had only just ended, and the Soviet Union remained a formal ally. But as he reviewed the early translations of Gouzenko's files, his disbelief turned to alarm. The documents described agents embedded within Canada's National Research Council, individuals with access to atomic energy research connected to the Manhattan Project. That night, while ministers debated how to proceed, the embassy made one last attempt. Witnesses later recalled two unidentified men loitering near the Gouzenko residence, their car engine idling through the small hours. Inside the safe house, the former clerk sat awake, clutching a revolver provided by the RCMP. Every creak of the floorboards made him start. He imagined footsteps, the click of a lock, the inevitable knock at the door. By dawn, he was still alive, and his evidence had reached the highest levels of Canadian intelligence. Officials contacted both MI5 and the FBI, transmitting summaries of his claims. Within hours, London and Washington understood what Canada had stumbled upon. The Soviets had been spying on their wartime allies even before victory was declared. When the sun rose over Ottawa on September 7th, 1945, the city seemed unchanged, yet the invisible front of a new conflict had opened. Gouzenko, hidden behind drawn curtains and guarded by armed officers, had become both witness and weapon in a struggle he barely comprehended. The Cold War had not been declared by statesmen in grand halls, but by a frightened man who chose truth over silence. 1945 to 1946. RCMP Safe House, Ottawa. The door to the safe house shut with a heavy sound that echoed inside Gouzenko's mind for weeks. Outside, snow blanketed Ottawa, erasing footprints as quickly as they were made. The city carried on as if nothing extraordinary had occurred, but within the walls of that anonymous building, a single defector was rewriting the post-war order. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police had secured him, yet they barely knew what to do with him. Canada had never handled a Soviet defector carrying state secrets. They treated Gouzenko not as a hero, but as a puzzle, one they feared might explode in their hands. Interrogations began immediately. Each day, plainclothes officers entered the small room where Gouzenko sat at a wooden table, his briefcase open beside him. They questioned him for hours, verifying every name, address, and code word. The process was slow, hampered by translation, by his accent, by their disbelief. He spoke of a network that reached into the National Research Council, the Department of Munitions and Supply, and even the British scientific delegation working on atomic research in Montreal. The scale stunned them. The documents he provided, telegrams, ciphered lists, and summaries of intercepted communications, were methodically cataloged and cross-checked. RCMP analysts began tracing the names through government rosters. One by one, the details matched. Positions, access, and movements aligned precisely with Gouzenko's claims. It was no fantasy. Canada, a country that prided itself on distance from great power intrigue, had become an unsuspecting battleground in the Soviet war for information. The revelations spread upward. Prime Minister Mackenzie King was briefed under tight secrecy. His first reaction was disbelief, his second, dread. The war had ended barely a month earlier, and the Soviet Union was still formally an ally. To act on Gouzenko's information risked a diplomatic rupture, yet to ignore it meant allowing an enemy network to operate unchecked within the government. The choice before Canada was historic, whether to confront espionage by a supposed friend or conceal it in the name of wartime unity. As investigators worked, Gouzenko lived in isolation. Curtains remained drawn, guards rotated outside, and every knock at the door froze his blood. The RCMP provided rations, newspapers, and a typewriter for his statements, but contact with the outside world was forbidden. The young clerk who once decoded Moscow's orders now lived like a prisoner of the democracy he had chosen. Nights were the worst, his wife asleep beside the crib, the wind clawing at the windows, and his mind replaying the embassy's routines. He wondered if the Soviets had already sent assassins across the river from Hull. Weeks turned into months. The Canadians realized they possessed a strategic weapon, first-hand evidence of Soviet espionage operations, not only in Canada, but throughout the Western Alliance. British and American intelligence officers arrived discreetly to debrief him. MI5 sent a small team from London, including cryptographers who verified the authenticity of his material. They recognized the code names of agents active in Britain and the United States, echoes of networks still operating undetected. The more they listened, the clearer the pattern became. The GRU had built an extensive ring during the war, targeting industrial and atomic research, recruiting civil servants, scientists, and engineers motivated by ideology or blackmail. Many were unknown to Western security services. For the first time, the scale of Soviet penetration came into focus. Gouzenko's documents revealed how intelligence flowed from laboratories in Montreal to handlers in Ottawa, then by coded cable to Moscow Center. The secrets of the Allied war effort, radar, jet propulsion, and atomic energy had passed silently eastward under the cover of diplomatic privilege. For Gouzenko, the interrogations were both confession and vindication. Each confirmed detail strengthened his fragile position within his protector's trust. He had traded one system of suspicion for another, yet this time his knowledge gave him value. Still, he feared that his usefulness would expire once his story was extracted. Canada could not hide him forever. Moscow's reach was long and its vengeance certain. In February 1946, after months of classified briefings, the Canadian government acted. A royal commission on espionage was established under Chief Justice Robert Kellock and Justice Roy Taschereau to examine Gouzenko's evidence. Subpoenas were issued quietly. Dozens of officials were questioned behind closed doors. The inquiries confirmed what Gouzenko had warned. Soviet espionage had penetrated the heart of the Canadian government. And as the snow melted outside the safe house, he realized that he would never again walk freely under his own name. 1946 to 1947, Ottawa, Canada. The government's announcement came quietly, tucked into the back pages of the newspapers, the formation of a royal commission to investigate matters of national security. Only a handful of people in Ottawa understood its true origin. A frightened clerk, a stolen briefcase, and a cascade of documents that shattered the illusion of Allied trust. For months, Canada had concealed the story of Igor Gouzenko's defection. Now, the secret could no longer be contained. Inside the secure rooms of Parliament, the Royal Commission on Espionage began its work. Chief Justice Robert Kellock and Justice Roy Taschereau presided over a small team of investigators and intelligence officers. Their task was monumental: to determine whether the Soviet Union had built a spy network inside the Canadian state. Each morning, couriers arrived bearing copies of Gouzenko's files, telegrams, translations, and cipher fragments that traced lines of communication between Moscow and Ottawa. Witnesses were called in one by one: civil servants, scientists, and technicians who had once passed unnoticed through government corridors now faced interrogation under oath. Some denied everything, others broke quickly, confronted with evidence they could not explain. A handful confessed, revealing recruitment methods that confirmed Gouzenko's accounts: quiet conversations at diplomatic receptions, meetings in dimly lit apartments, envelopes exchanged for promises of ideological glory. The GRU's agents had been ordinary people drawn into extraordinary treachery. The Commission's hearings were conducted in secret, but rumors seeped through the Capitol like smoke. Journalists speculated about espionage in the atomic project. Foreign diplomats whispered of arrests. Canada's reputation for calm governance faltered as the truth emerged that for years the Soviet Union had harvested intelligence from within its wartime allies' own ministries. The revelations spread beyond Ottawa. In London, MI5 reviewed Gouzenko's files and identified overlapping code names in British archives. Across the Atlantic, the FBI received parallel reports. The network uncovered in Canada appeared to be part of a much larger design. American analysts, alarmed, re examined their own security procedures. The unity of the wartime alliance was unraveling before the ink on the peace treaties had dried. In February 1946, arrests began. The RCMP moved quietly at first, detaining suspects under emergency regulations. Among them were senior officials, trade officers, and scientists who had handled classified information. Public reaction ranged from disbelief to outrage. The trials that followed pulled Canada into an unfamiliar spotlight, a small country suddenly standing at the center of a global intelligence confrontation. The courtroom scenes were grim. Witnesses shielded their faces from photographers as they entered the Supreme Court building. Prosecutors read from telegrams in Gouzenko's hand, linking the accused to Soviet handlers. Defense lawyers claimed fabrication, but the evidence was overwhelming. Telegrams encoded in GRU ciphers, payment records in rubles, and letters written in invisible ink. Each item carried the mechanical precision of state-directed espionage. For Gouzenko, now living under RCMP protection, the proceedings were both vindication and torment. He was not permitted to appear publicly, nor to reveal his location. At night, he listened to radio bulletins announcing convictions secured through his documents and threats from Moscow denouncing him as a traitor and liar. In the Soviet press, editorials branded him a criminal deserter serving capitalist propaganda. But in the West, his name became synonymous with the new age of distrust. The Commission's final report confirmed the existence of a Soviet espionage network in Canada, and by extension, within the Allied intelligence structure. It concluded that espionage had continued even after the war, targeting atomic research and diplomatic communications. The implications were staggering. While Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin had spoken of peace, their agents had already been stealing from one another. Canada's allies acted quickly. In Washington, security screenings were tightened. In London, MI5 launched internal reviews that would later expose the Cambridge spy ring. What began as a small investigation in Ottawa rippled across continents, forcing governments to confront the uncomfortable truth that the Cold War had already begun, not through speeches or armies, but through stolen papers and whispered codes. When the Royal Commission ended in 1947, its conclusions marked a turning point in global intelligence. Gouzenko's testimony, once dismissed as paranoia, became the foundation for Western counter-espionage strategy. The documents he had carried from the embassy now rested in vaults across 3 nations. 1946 to 1948, Moscow and Ottawa. The reaction from Moscow was swift and venomous. Within days of the first Canadian arrests, Soviet newspapers erupted with denunciations of a fabricated anti-Soviet provocation. State radio called Igor Gouzenko a criminal, a deserter, a man driven by bourgeois corruption. To the Kremlin, the defection of a cipher clerk was less about one man's betrayal than the potential damage to its reputation. The secret war that Moscow had waged in silence was now being dragged into the open. Inside the Soviet Foreign Ministry, panic rippled through the diplomatic corps. Cipher clerks, translators, and attachés were summoned for questioning. Files were sealed, personnel rotated, and embassies abroad instructed to reinforce internal discipline. Stalin's instinct was immediate: purge and conceal. Any official whose reliability was uncertain was recalled for consultation. Some never returned. Those who did came back diminished, faces thinner, voices lower, their loyalty publicly reaffirmed under duress. Gouzenko's defection had exposed more than agents. It revealed the vulnerability of the Soviet system itself. The Kremlin's obsession with control had failed to prevent the escape of secrets that now threatened the image of post-war victory. Soviet intelligence, humiliated, began to restructure its foreign apparatus. Within the GRU, senior officers were demoted or transferred. Surveillance of diplomatic staff intensified to levels approaching madness. The KGB, newly reorganized, took direct oversight of embassy security. Defection, once unthinkable, had become a virus the state feared more than espionage itself. At the same time, Soviet propaganda worked tirelessly to reclaim the narrative. Pravda and Izvestia filled their pages with accusations that Western intelligence had abducted Gouzenko and forged documents to discredit the USSR. Radio Moscow broadcast daily commentaries portraying Canada as a puppet of American imperialism. The Western world, it declared, was preparing for a new crusade against socialism. For Soviet citizens, the message was clear: trust no one, speak carefully, and never envy the freedom of the capitalist nations. In Canada, the reaction was equally tense. The Soviet embassy withdrew most of its staff, replacing them with loyalists screened by Moscow. Canadian officials, wary of further infiltration, monitored every diplomatic contact. Behind closed doors, RCMP officers and British liaison agents discussed whether the Soviets might attempt to assassinate Gouzenko. His name was now public. His face appeared in newspapers worldwide. To protect him, authorities relocated his family under new identities, moving them from city to city across Ontario. They lived in suburban anonymity, never staying long enough to be noticed. Gouzenko watched the Kremlin's denials unfold from behind drawn curtains. Through radio broadcasts and newspapers, he saw himself transformed into a caricature, a greedy opportunist or a Western invention. The reality was simpler and sadder: a man cut off from his homeland, despised by the regime he once served, and distrusted by many in the country that sheltered him. The RCMP continued to question him for follow-up intelligence, but as time passed, visits grew less frequent. His usefulness was fading, replaced by newer sources and broader intelligence networks, now forming among Western allies. Across the Atlantic, his revelations reshaped policy. British and American intelligence agencies, alarmed by the scale of Soviet penetration, established closer cooperation with Canada, laying the groundwork for what would later become the Five Eyes Alliance. The phrase Gouzenko Affair circulated in diplomatic cables as shorthand for the dawn of a new era, one where information, not territory, defined the balance of power. In Moscow, however, the lesson was different. Stalin took the affair as proof that the West had always been the enemy. Orders went out to tighten ideological discipline among Soviet citizens abroad. Travel became rarer, surveillance omnipresent. Every embassy became a fortress of suspicion. The idea of cooperation with the West, fragile even at the war's end, dissolved completely. By the close of 1948, the Gouzenko affair had faded from headlines, but its effects had settled deep into the architecture of global politics. The brief wartime friendship between East and West was replaced by mutual hostility, fortified by secrecy and fear. A single defector had not destroyed that alliance. He had merely revealed the truth that it never truly existed. 1950s to 1970s, Ontario, Canada. In the years after the Royal Commission, Igor Gouzenko disappeared from public view. Officially, he no longer existed. The Canadian government moved him and his family under assumed names, settling them first in rural Ontario and later in quiet suburbs outside Toronto. The houses were modest, the neighbors unaware. Only a few officials in the Royal Canadian Mounted Police knew the truth, that the man behind the curtains was the defector whose briefcase had altered the course of world history. Gouzenko's daily life became a study in paranoia. Every phone ring startled him. Every knock at the door felt like the beginning of the end. He refused to answer unless the caller used a prearranged phrase. Mail arrived through intermediaries, and his signature was a carefully practiced pseudonym. When he walked outside, he avoided routines. No two routes to the grocery store ever the same. To those who glimpsed him, he was a quiet man with an accent, polite but guarded. No one knew he believed the KGB might kill him at any moment. The RCMP maintained periodic contact, checking his security, updating cover stories, and delivering small stipends. But the protection was imperfect. As the Cold War deepened, Canada's intelligence resources stretched thin. Gouzenko's file drifted through bureaucratic channels, reduced to an occasional report marked sensitive, do not circulate. For years he lived as if exiled inside his own country, cut off from his homeland, mistrusted by his protectors, haunted by the secrets he could never discuss. He wrote in notebooks late at night, recording memories of Moscow, the embassy, and the night he fled. Writing was therapy, but also insurance, a record of why he had done what he did. His first manuscript, This Was My Choice, published in 1948, revealed fragments of his ordeal, but never the full truth. To preserve his safety, he avoided public appearances. When the media insisted, he appeared in interviews wearing a white hood to hide his face, an image that became one of the Cold War's enduring symbols. The hooded defector spoke softly, his accent heavy, describing a world ruled by fear and deception. For audiences, he was a ghost of a war that had not yet ended. Life under alias weighed on his family. His children grew up knowing their real surname, but forbidden to use it. School records were falsified, birthdays celebrated in secrecy. The tension wore on Svetlana, who longed for normalcy. Yet returning to the Soviet Union was impossible. Moscow still considered them traitors. Their relatives there vanished into silence, letters unanswered. Gouzenko lived with the guilt of having severed two worlds, the one he escaped and the one he could never fully join. In the 1950s, as spy scandals erupted across Europe and America, Burgess and McLean in London, Fuchs in Los Alamos, Gouzenko's story gained renewed attention. Western intelligence officers quietly acknowledged him as the man who first revealed the scale of Soviet penetration. His documents had guided early counterintelligence programs, but few remembered his name. He was both foundational and forgotten, the inconvenient origin of the Cold War's unending vigilance. Occasionally, he allowed himself to speak publicly, still masked, always cautious. His tone grew bitter with age. He warned that the free world misunderstood the nature of its adversary, that communism was not simply politics, but a system of fear that consumed loyalty and truth alike. Many dismissed him as a relic of an earlier era, but his warnings echoed through the decades of proxy wars and ideological suspicion that followed. By the 1970s, age and anonymity had worn him down. He worked briefly as an artist, painting surreal cityscapes filled with watchtowers and locked doors, reflections of a mind that never escaped surveillance. Friends described him as kind, but distant, as if part of him remained locked inside that cipher room on Somerset Street. The Cold War had expanded beyond anything he imagined, yet his own life remained frozen at its beginning. He once wrote in a private note, later found after his death, "I defected for freedom, but freedom came with its own walls." It was a quiet epitaph for a man who had traded one form of captivity for another. Behind the white hood and the false names, Gouzenko had become a living symbol of a century built on secrecy, the first defector of the modern age, condemned to live forever in the shadows he had helped expose. 1950s to 1970s, Ontario, Canada. In the years after the Royal Commission, Igor Gouzenko disappeared from public view. Officially, he no longer existed. The Canadian government moved him and his family under assumed names, settling them first in rural Ontario and later in quiet suburbs outside Toronto. The houses were modest, the neighbors unaware. Only a few officials in the Royal Canadian Mounted Police knew the truth, that the man behind the curtains was the defector whose briefcase had altered the course of world history. Gouzenko's daily life became a study in paranoia. Every phone ring startled him. Every knock at the door felt like the beginning of the end. He refused to answer unless the caller used a prearranged phrase. Mail arrived through intermediaries, and his signature was a carefully practiced pseudonym. When he walked outside, he avoided routines. No two routes to the grocery store ever the same. To those who glimpsed him, he was a quiet man with an accent, polite but guarded. No one knew he believed the KGB might kill him at any moment. The RCMP maintained periodic contact, checking his security, updating cover stories, and delivering small stipends. But the protection was imperfect. As the Cold War deepened, Canada's intelligence resources stretched thin. Gouzenko's file drifted through bureaucratic channels, reduced to an occasional report marked sensitive, "Do not circulate." For years he lived as if exiled inside his own country, cut off from his homeland, mistrusted by his protectors, haunted by the secrets he could never discuss. He wrote in notebooks late at night, recording memories of Moscow, the embassy, and the night he fled. Writing was therapy, but also insurance, a record of why he had done what he did. His first manuscript, "This Was My Choice," published in 1948, revealed fragments of his ordeal, but never the full truth. To preserve his safety, he avoided public appearances. When the media insisted, he appeared in interviews wearing a white hood to hide his face. an image that became one of the Cold War's enduring symbols. The hooded defector spoke softly, his accent heavy, describing a world ruled by fear and deception. For audiences, he was a ghost of a war that had not yet ended. Life under alias weighed on his family. His children grew up knowing their real surname, but forbidden to use it. School records were falsified, birthdays celebrated in secrecy. The tension wore on Svetlana, who longed for normalcy. Yet returning to the Soviet Union was impossible. Moscow still considered them traitors. Their relatives there vanished into silence, letters unanswered. Gouzenko lived with the guilt of having severed two worlds, the one he escaped and the one he could never fully join. In the 1950s, as spy scandals erupted across Europe and America, Burgess and McLean in London, Fuchs in Los Alamos, Gouzenko's story gained renewed attention. Western intelligence officers quietly acknowledged him as the man who first revealed the scale of Soviet penetration. His documents had guided early counterintelligence programs, but few remembered his name. He was both foundational and forgotten, the inconvenient origin of the Cold War's unending vigilance. Occasionally, he allowed himself to speak publicly, still masked, always cautious. His tone grew bitter with age. He warned that the free world misunderstood the nature of its adversary, that communism was not simply politics, but a system of fear that consumed loyalty and truth alike. Many dismissed him as a relic of an earlier era, but his warnings echoed through the decades of proxy wars and ideological suspicion that followed. By the 1970s, age and anonymity had worn him down. He worked briefly as an artist, painting surreal cityscapes filled with watchtowers and locked doors, reflections of a mind that never escaped surveillance. Friends described him as kind, but distant, as if part of him remained locked inside that cipher room on Somerset Street. The Cold War had expanded beyond anything he imagined, yet his own life remained frozen at its beginning. He once wrote in a private note, later found after his death, "I defected for freedom, but freedom came with its own walls." It was a quiet epitaph for a man who had traded one form of captivity for another. Behind the white hood and the false names, Gouzenko had become a living symbol of a century built on secrecy, the first defector of the modern age, condemned to live forever in the shadows he had helped expose.